Welcome everyone to this Meet the Researcher series of ATHENA and Monnet on the EU as a global actor. Multiple security crises have led to increased attention to the EU's role as a global actor. How can the EU become a more effective global actor, and how can it contribute to international peace and security? These are some of the questions that we are trying to respond with the ATHENA and Monnet chair. My name is Dr. Dimitris Bouris, and I'm the chairholder, and I'm doing this work with my colleague, Dr. Olga Burliu, who is a senior researcher in the chair. We're trying to address all these kind of questions through an interdisciplinary policy and also research-based activities and courses that complement teaching, research, and dissemination activities. The name of the chair, Athena, is inspired by the Greek goddess of war and wisdom. And what we're trying to do with this chair is to strengthen and promote excellence in teaching and research on the EU's role as a global actor, foster and expand and consolidate a broader community of scholars, stakeholders, and policymakers, and generate knowledge and insights. And last but not least, we're trying to bring the EU closer to the Dutch and to the European public and youth. And it is in this framework that we are organizing the Meet the Researcher series. And the idea is for our students and also our viewers on YouTube channel to have the opportunity to get insights from well-established colleagues who are researching different aspects of the EU's role as a global actor. And the idea is to look at how they conduct their own research, what approaches they use, what case studies they use, and what kind of questions drive their research, and what kind of driving forces is behind the research. The idea, again, is for these events to be used to inspire our own students, not just in this class, but overall, to reflect on their own positionalities as well as their own research methods. And I'm very happy and honored to welcome in this class with us Professor Münevver Cebeci, who is a professor at the European Studies Institute at the Marmara University in Istanbul. Münevver has worked as a senior researcher at the European Neighborhood Policy Chair at the College of Europe between 2016 and 2017, and she contributed to the Med Research project, which was financed by the European Union under the framework of its Horizon 2020 program. Professor Cebeci has taught several courses, and her course on international politics of the EU was awarded as an Monnet permanent course by the European Commission between 2002 and 2007. She holds a PhD in EU politics and international relations from the European Union Institute, Marmara University, a Master's of Science in International Relations from the London School of Economics, and a Master's in International Relations from the Social Science Institute, Marmara University. Her research interests include European foreign policy, especially the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership and the European Neighborhood Policy, and also security studies, and I would say more specifically critical security studies. Münevver has published several books and articles, and her latest work includes a monograph entitled Deconstructing Ideal Power Europe, the EU and the Arab Change. Münevver, thank you so much for making the time to be with us in this rainy afternoon in Amsterdam. And I would like to start by taking you back to your PhD years, and just to ask you what led you to pursue a PhD in the first place. Why did you want to pursue a PhD? And also what was your PhD about? And what made your research, this particular topic?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Dimitri. I should say that it's always a pleasure for me to be with you and your students and sharing my views with them. So thanks so much for the invitation. Well, it's very interesting because before knowing it, I found myself being a research assistant at the EU Institute. Back then, it was the EEC Institute. So, it's I did my undergrad studies. Then there was this post of a research assistant. So I directly applied to the institute, but then the EU changed, our institute's name changed, so it became the EU Institute, and now it is called as the Institute of European Studies. And back then, actually, I didn't have any idea with regard to, why I became a research assistant whatsoever, because my original plan was to become a diplomat. But then that's life, I guess. And what happened is that I was expected to do my PhD on the EU, because my master's, my first master's was mainly on international relations. And my master's thesis was on NATO's Partnership for Peace. So I'm originally a security person doing security studies. So I started, and I started with a very positivist view, actually. And back then it was what we did in IR. We were mostly positivists, and we went through a very Eurocentric positivist way of seeing things. But then, it's like I had to do my PhD on the EU because I was a research assistant at the institute, and that's why I had to find a topic where I could combine security studies with the EU. And first, actually, I didn't intend to compare Turkey and the EU in terms of their security identities, which is my PhD topic. But the thing is that I started with the idea of looking at the EU-WU NATO triangle in European crisis management. So my original or initial topic was that. But what happened is that Western European Union ceased to exist. So there was no triangle left for me to analyze. And as an act of faith, I said, okay, then, I should do something on the Copenhagen School, because I truly adored the work of Münevver, together with Berbuzan, of course. So I reflected on, doing something on securitization. And I thought that because Turkey was at that time going through EU harmonization process, and because I held a very Eurocentric view, I thought that, it's like looking at Turkey's transformation in security terms as well would just work well. And so that's why I came up with the idea of comparing European and Turkish security identities within the framework of the Copenhagen School approach to security, which is mainly a social constructivist approach, which takes security as intersubjective and looks at the processes of how security speech acts turn into securitization, in the sense that, after the acceptance of an audience, the process ends up in taking extraordinary measures against the said threat. It's like, this is a very simplistic explanation of securitization, but still. Then, it's like my major argument was that the EU actually caused Turkey to desecuritize. I defended my PhD in 2004, so it was a totally different period for Turkey and for the European Union as well. So the thing is that I saw that both sides were actually securitizing each other heavily, intensively. And while on the one hand, the EU caused Turkey to desecuritize itself through internal political reform or security reform as well, the relationship between the EU and Turkey was also based on EU's securitization of Turkey. So my conclusion was that Turkey could desecuritize itself to successfully achieve desecuritization or EU harmonization as such. But on the other hand, the EU or EU Europeans could not still desecuritize Turkey. So that was the major problem that I saw in the relationship back then. So that's basically it with regard to my PhD. My methodology back then was that I pursued a deductive approach, applying a specific theory to a specific case. And I mainly, back then, it's like sources on the internet were rather limited, so I had to go to different libraries in Turkey. It's like especially Bilkent Library and Metüz Library. So I didn't stay in Istanbul during the weekends. So I went there, I searched in their libraries, and during the week I was at my own university's library doing a lot of research. And because Turkey's security strategy was classified, it was not possible to reach information about it. So, for example, I had to go through the newspapers and news on the agencies, so that it's like I could see how Turkey's security strategy was formed, if there are any leaks whatsoever that I could rely on. But the thing is that, it's like newspapers or news reports of agencies whatsoever may not be very reliable. So I had to do meticulous research in order to find out what was basically there as data that I could academically use. So it was a huge challenge and limitation for the thesis. So I went through a lot of newspapers. I checked again, it's like, and I found out that I actually went through hundreds of such reports whatsoever. But, it's like I looked at 100. I actually used 100 newspapers to, it's like to reflect or to support my argument in that regard, and so it was rather challenging, the newspapers part. But the most important research was, of course, on primary sources. It's like official EU documents. Back then, they were named as progress reports. Progress reports, speeches of EU officials were very important for me, and also speeches of Turkish leaders, foreign ministers, and the heads of general staff. So I had to look at them as well.
Thank you, Münevver. And you brought a perspective which we tend not to think about, because, nowadays we're in the class and some of our students want, to do discourse analysis, and we tell them, okay, it will be easy for you to find these discourses online, but you take us through a time where it wasn't as easy and all these things were not accessible. Yeah. So it was 10 times more difficult to do this kind of research. And I do want to delve a little bit more into this more practically, because from what I understand, you analyze all these different documents and speeches. And could you tell us in practice how you did it? Like what kind of analysis did you do?
Yeah, sure. I specifically looked at those speeches to see how Turkey securitizes things and how they became desecuritized internally, in terms of internal reforms in Turkey. That was one part of it. But then I also had to look at how both sides securitize each other. So I was specifically looking for security speech acts where the security referent was obviously stated. For example, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing came up saying that taking Turkey in would mean the end of Europe, would be the end of Europe, not mean. You know, it's like he obviously said, you know, taking Turkey in will be the end of Europe. This is an open security speech act where the security referent is the EU and a threat is Turkey. You know, so I was looking at such things, and you know, a crucial part of identity construction is also exaggeration in some cases, especially if you want to securitize things to avoid them. You know, I also recall a Finnish diplomat, for example, saying that the moment the ink is dry on Turkey's accession treaty, what would happen was that 1 million Turks would directly go to Helsinki. Back then, you know, it's like only perhaps, you know, it's like I'm just giving you a number which is rather, you know, it's like not based on statistics or anything, but you know, it's like a vague number. But you know, the people who held passports in Turkey were not even like 3 million or something when they used this discourse. You know, it's like how could like 1 million people go to Helsinki? You know. So that is how, you know, I tried to find the language which securitized the relations on both sides. You know, it's like or on the other hand, where in Turkey, for example, and there was this rhetoric that the EU uses the language of the terrorists. You know, so that's a speech act as well. But then, you know, it's like in Turkey, for example, that speech act changed in the harmonization process, especially after 2002. Before 2002, actually, but especially after 2002, the public, the general staff, everybody was supporting a desecuritization in Turkey. So in that regard, that securitizing language was no longer used.
What was the unit of analysis? Was it words? Was it sentences? Because I'm just trying to think of my students that they might question now, how do I do this discourse analysis?
Sure. And there, you know, it's like I especially looked at various texts. I can say that it was intertextual. So I especially looked at texts produced by both sides, officials and leaders. And there I specifically looked for those sentences which involved the Security Speech Act, or which involved those sentences that were desecuritizing in Turkey's case.
Perfect. Thank you. In 2012, you published an article in Millennium Journal, which was entitled European Foreign Policy Research Reconsidered, Constructing an Ideal Power Europe Through Theory, ? And I mean, you know already the story about how I was traumatized by this article, but it's not your fault. But I just want to ask you how, you know, about the idea behind this article. What made you start writing this article? What made you, you know, want to publish this article? What pushed you to write it? And, you know, if you can tell us a little bit more about the article itself.
Sure. This article actually reflects my evolution, my cognitive evolution, I should say, because, you know, it's I started dealing with more critical research, and there was a lot of things that came to my mind back then. But the thing is that first, maybe I should mention that I already said that I was a security person. So mainly what I did was that after my PhD as well, for a certain period of time, I made research on Turkey's involvement in European security and defense policy. Back then it was named as such. Now it's common security and defense policy. So there, what I realized was that the EU was not actually keeping its words that it gave to Turkey in this regard. But, it was continuously the same. So I was thinking that the EU was not abiding by the major international norm of pacta sunt servanda, you keep your promise, the contractual promises. So that led me to think that, and back then the normative power Europe literature was evolving, and it rapidly became the dominant literature to use in European foreign policy research. And I was thinking that, well, when the EU does not abide by the most basic form of norm of international relations, then how can we call it as a normative power? So that was my starting point. But the thing is that I didn't want to do something specifically on Turkey, because the thing is that I'm an expert mainly on European security, European foreign policy, and European security and defense policy. So the thing is that I also wanted to break this notion that the people from the periphery can only study the periphery. So they cannot know Europe or research Europe or teach Europe better than the Europeans themselves. So I wanted to break this preconceived notion. That's why I wanted to do something general about European foreign policy and something theoretical about European foreign policy. That's how I came up with the idea of criticizing the dominant discourse on the European Union, which represented it as a force for good in international relations. And as a normative power. So that is how I started doing my research. And actually my research brought me to this post-structuralist framework, because I was trying to find how I could criticize the European Union and the discourse on the European Union, and how I could criticize all those conceptions of Europe as transformative power, civilizing power, normative power, whatsoever power, which would represent the EU as a force for good in the world. So my research led me to post-structuralism and postmodernism. Actually, I started with Lyotard, so I should say postmodernism first, and then came the post-structuralist framework as I widened my research. So that's how it happened.
Something, how, but please feel free not to respond if you don't want, but how easy or difficult was it to do this kind of research a decade ago? It's not a lot of years, so it's not that long ago, but it's still long enough, because what we see is that this more kind of critical work has only started, at least in EU studies, has only started coming in the last decade. So someone could say that you were one of the first people who started doing this critical work. How easy or difficult was it?
It was really difficult because, I really didn't know if I would get published if I criticized the EU as such, because there was a critical European securities back then as well, but it was not criticizing the EU that much. It was, it's like it had the claim that it was self-reflexive, but in the end, you know, all the literature that I read about it ended with suggesting or giving prescriptions with regard to how the EU can be a better normative actor, or how the EU should be a normative actor. So they ended up in doing this. So it was a challenge to come up with this, but there were some specific work, you know, it's like Thomas Dietz's work, also Calypso Nicolaidis to be the first with, you know, House and you know, their seminal article in that regard, Utopia, and also Michael Merlingen. I must say that, you know, it's Michael Merlingen's work inspired me a lot in that regard. That's why in the article there's this part on dominative dimension of European foreign policy. It comes from Michael Merlingen.
Thank you, Münevver. In the years that followed after this article, you continued publishing different articles on EU and Turkey's democratization, as well as on deconstructing the EU standards of civilization, the case of Turkey. Could you please let us know how these works are connected to your previous work or previous research, and talk to us a little bit more about this work?
Yes, sure. I did something on, it was 2016, I guess. I did something on whether Turkey's case was a case of de-Europeanization or counter-conduct. So it was a mainly Foucauldian study. And also I had this Standards of Civilization article. Initially, I wrote this article for the annual conference of the Millennium Journal. So it was the major theme of the conference was rethinking standards of civilization. So that's why, you know, I needed to write something about standards of civilization. But as I read into that, what I saw was that it was very much related to what I was doing, because I saw that, you know, standards of civilization as applied today in the case of the EU were actually markers of European identity, and specifically markers of Europe's ideal identity. So that's how I used Hartmut Baer's approach to standards of civilization, because it's not new that the EU was named as pursuing a standards of civilization, you know, approach, I should say. So Baer just came up with this idea, saying that the EU was actually pursuing a similar approach to what Europeans did in the 17th to 19th centuries, to accept, for example, powers to the Concert of Europe, right? So it was very good for me, because, you know, so I knew that Europeans applied certain conditions on the Ottoman Empire, so that the Ottoman Empire could become a part of the European state system, or could become part of the Concert of Europe in 1856. So the thing is that the Ottoman Empire also had to pass a reform rescript, you know, fulfilling the conditions of the Europeans, so that, you know, it could become part of Concert of Europe. So Baer's framework for me was the basis on which I based my research, and came up with this idea and wrote about it. So it's very much related to Ideal Power Europe again, because I see it as a marker of identity, especially Europe's ideal identity.
And you know, this also helps us trace the continuity of your work as well and of your research. You already touched upon this a little bit on research methods, but I just wanted to ask you, what kind of research methods do you usually use for your own research, and whether you just use one method or whether you get inspiration from other methods as well?
Okay. The thing is, you know, it's like as my research evolved, now I can define myself as, or position myself, academically position myself as a postmodernist, post-structuralist, as I said before. So this means that I mainly approach discourse as practice. So I'm very much interested in the performative function of discourse, how it creates identities, subjects, or how it creates IR in general, or security, our notions of security, the collective meanings that we attach to several things, identities, whatsoever. So the research that I do is mainly about interpretation. And what I borrow from post-structuralism is that I look at the binaries and look at how differences are constructed upon those binaries that we use in the text, or that are used in the texts. So texts are very important for me because I try to see the contradictions in the text, tensions in the text, and silences in the text, because silences are as important as what we talk about. For example, the EU's representation as a peace process ignores or silences what happened in Algeria back then, you know, when the EU was founded, right? So this is how it goes. And the thing is that I do a second reading, but maybe I should explain second reading a bit so that we can get some clues about how to do it. The thing is that a first reading offers us what the writer tries to say. You know, it's like that's the writer's view of the text, or what the writer wants us to know, right? But the second reading gives us our interpretation of that text. That is how we can see the contradictions in the text, the tensions in the text, or the silences in the text. It's kind of reading in between the lines. But the thing is that, you know, it's like I usually use this analogy when I teach my students how I do second reading. The thing is that, you know, in Turkey, we go through a lot of tests to enter the university, for example, or to enter high schools, etc. So in that sense, there in those tests, and you also have it in TOEFL, etc. You know, you're given a paragraph and you're asked to answer questions about that specific paragraph. So what happens is that when you just read the paragraph and directly answer the questions after your first reading of it, you usually get the right answer. But if you make the mistake of reading it for a second time to make sure that your answer is good, you know, what you do is you make a second reading, but this time your mind does not work as such. Your first reading gave you what the writer wanted to give you. So in that sense, your first answer was correct. But when you read it for a second time, you add your own interpretation to the text. That's why you always think that there are two answers to the same question. But you only think so. Why? Because the thing is that one of them is your interpretation, the other one is what the writer tried to give you in the first place. So that's why you make the mistake, you know? So second reading is about reading a text with your own interpretation of it to see the tensions in the text, the contradictions in the text, or the binaries in the text. If it's, in my case, if it gets into othering, you know, or securitizing things whatsoever. So that's mainly the approach that I used to look at the relationship between identity and foreign policy. But I should also say that in my research, this is a Derridan approach, you know, it's like, so it comes from Jacques Derrida, mainly, this double reading of text. So I do deconstruction and displacement in this regard. But the thing is that although many think that Foucauldian and Derridan approaches to discourse are different, and I agree, their approaches to discourse are different, but the thing is that we can do a lot by borrowing from both of them, because while a second reading gives you those contradictions, etc., the Foucauldian framework lets you to see the power-knowledge relationship within which that discourse or that specific text that you're looking at feeds into power relations, and also power in turn supports that kind of knowledge. So I think I always try to use both of them together as much as I can. And so I don't follow a specific method or a coherent, not coherent, but a concrete methodology in this regard, because I'm a post-structuralist, and post-structuralism is mainly about non-method, because you do not actually want to repeat the dominant discourse. So you try to destabilize it. You know, so how can you use a concrete methodology when you try to destabilize something? Which is a given, right? So what I do is, but of course, you know, you should never forget, otherwise it would not be academic. You should have a coherent research strategy. You know, so Foucault, for example, refers to this as an attitude of contestability, because you have to contest things, right? And you have to use analytic devices. So those analytic devices that I use are the text. So my selection of the texts are very important, because we are not cherry picking here. What we are doing is, you know, it's like we have to find the most relevant discourse for supporting our analysis. Otherwise, it will not be academic, right? So that's what I'm basically doing.
Thank you so much, Münevver. I think this is very helpful, and you managed to explain it in a very accessible way, actually, because it's not an easy research method. It's not an easy thing to do. It's a difficult thing to do. But I think that the way you explained it definitely shed light on how to do it. And maybe there are questions after that on this as well. I want to move a little bit to more recent years. In parallel to all this research on the EU, on EU Turkey, you recently wrote a chapter on how the EU constructs the Middle East as well, for the Routledge Handbook of EU Middle East Relations, which was co-edited by Michelle Patz, Daniela Huber, and myself. And I would like to ask you if you can talk us very briefly about your chapter and what made you look at the Middle East as such.
Well, the thing is that it also evolved from, I should say, the times that I wrote my book about EU and Arab change and how I could deconstruct EU's ideal power through that case. And there, something that I didn't write there was that there are three Middle East that the EU refers to when it constructs the Middle East as such. You know, the first one is the Middle East as part of European identity because of historical ties, etc. In Bahar Rumeli's terms, we can call this as the Middle East as the liminal, right? So it's in that sense, it's represented as an area which should be stabilized by the EU, so that, you know, that area can be open to, I shouldn't say open to, but, you know, that area would not pose a threat to the EU as such in terms of instabilities and conflicts. On the one hand, so cooperation is the basis of this discourse that the EU uses when constructing the Middle East as a part of Europe due to its historical ties, economic ties, etc. On the other hand, there is the Middle East out there, which is rather dangerous and also which is conflictual. And finally, there is this Middle East within the EU or within Europe, which means the residents of Europe, you know, the immigrants, who went there to work, right, and to live there. And so they are seen as part of European society on the one hand, but also they are seen as potential threats. So that's what I wanted to reflect on, and I did it through three dimensions in which the EU approaches them. The first one is the security dimension, the second one is a political cultural dimension, and the third one is socio-economic dimension. So I again used a post-structures framework to have a look at it, but because it was a handbook chapter, I wrote it in those terms. So my methodology was different from the methodology that I used in my articles, and I did more of a discourse analysis than, you know, doing this full-fledged deconstruction. But I wanted to show how the EU represents the Middle East as imperfect, dangerous, and actually backward in socio-economic terms, and how it also represents the Middle Eastern youth as a threat in that regard. So I argued that in all these three dimensions, the EU has a very securitized approach to the Middle East. And that is basically how I did it. And I only looked at the documents, the general documents, in the relationship between the EU and the Middle East, meaning European neighborhood policy documents or Mediterranean partnership documents whatsoever, but or Union for the Mediterranean documents, rather than looking specifically at the EU's relationship with Algeria, for example.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Münevver. I have more questions, but I know that we're running out of time, so I do want to give the opportunity to the students in this class to ask any questions they might have. Are there any questions or points for clarification?
Yeah. On the point about post-structuralism being about non-method, I was wondering, because as I was being taught previously was that the power of science is that in using the same method, you're able to credibly critique other articles. So in that sense, using different methods then something you're trying to critique, do you not create artificial critiques in a sense? So do you not create artificial differences where the power of the original critique is kind of washed away? If you can.
Wow, that's a very challenging and good question. Thank you for that. Yes, that's the thing. That's the curse of post-structuralism, because you're always the one or the scapegoat for being that person, first of all, who is always cherry picking and not doing something academic in the first place. And also you're always faced with the question of so what? Okay, you gave us the second reading, but so what? It's like it doesn't help anything. It's like you just put it there, but you don't prescribe anything, you don't suggest anything whatsoever. But the thing is that, it's like, and mind you, not all post-structuralist work has to be like mine. It's like I'm more on the post-modernist end of it. So the thing is that if I use the same methodology, I will be serving that very neoliberal governmentality, which we also observe in the academia. So the thing is that what I'm trying to do is to offer because I'm trying to offer a new framework, because I think I'm actually using the same tools, or I'm actually repeating the dominant discourse, because there's no way to be immune to it, but the thing is that, of course, when I'm doing my research, I select my samples accordingly. If needed, I do interviews whatsoever, etc. But the thing is that when I say that, it's like it's non-method, it's mainly about not serving those established Eurocentric ways of doing things. That's what we attempt to do. It's something, it's like you're still scientific, but it might be different from the notion of science as put forward by the West. So there are different ways of doing things or interpreting things as such. I hope this answers your question.
Thank you, Münevver. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
I know. Can you hear me from here? Maybe.
Just a little bit.
Let me.
Can you this is just like a practical question. Can you repeat in which time this is about your work in from the EU towards the Middle East as a region? Can you again repeat in which dimensions this securitization of this region became apparent in your study? So I thought I heard you had socioeconomic dimensions, but can you again repeat which dimensions this were?
Yeah, you mean the 3 dimensions that I looked at it, like security, socioeconomic, and political cultural. Shall I just open them a bit for you? When I talk about the security dimension, for example, the Middle East outside is obviously constructed as dangerous or conflictual. It's like in the EU text, you can openly see that. For example, Mogherini is said at the an inauguration speech at the Union for the Mediterranean meeting that it's like the Mediterranean is the most conflictual region in the world. It's like something, the wording, I don't remember exactly, but it was very open like this. So so that's obvious, but in security terms, there's always, especially after the attacks in France, etc. It's like there is this notion of the Middle East in Europe being a threat to Europeans. meaning the Middle Eastern people with a Middle Eastern origin living in Europe becoming threats to the Europeans. And socioeconomically, this is also securitized. Why? Because, you know, it's like these people take Europeans' jobs, but not only that, but on the basis of the Middle Eastern youth that is growing as a population, you know, becoming more than Egypt's population. When, for example, Carl Bildt talked about it, he said that, you know, it's like there would be like 150 million young people in the Middle East in a decade. So it was in 2007 when he talked about this. So it meant that, he said that it would be a disaster if Europe could not deal with this issue, because these people would seek jobs in Europe whatsoever. You know, so this is how even socio-political, socio-economic issues are also securitized in those terms. And on the other hand, what happens is that again, there is a very securitized way of seeing cooperation with the Middle East. You know, the first identity of the Middle East that I talked about, which is the liminal, right? You know, and which is good for cooperation in that sense. But there, the major view is to avoid migration flows, right? And or regulate migration in a sense. And so there again, there is a securitized logic. And then with regard to the political cultural dimension, I talked about this very preconceived notion with regard to Arab societies about Islam being incompatible with democracy. And I wrote about how the Europeans actually saw the Arab uprisings as an anomaly to their culture, because in European view, Arab peoples cannot actually seek freedom, right? You know, it's like this is how it goes. And that's how they couldn't also promptly react, right? You know, when the uprisings first erupted. To the contrary, European countries offered help to the authoritarian regimes there, you know, providing pepper gas, or, you know, offering other types of cooperation in that regard to suppress the uprisings. So in that regard, I tried to show how this conception of Europe leads to this construction of Europeans as superior to the Middle Eastern people, and how actually they Europeans can teach the Middle Eastern people how to achieve democracy, etc. So because when you put yourself in a teaching position, it also means that you see the others as you know, the ones to be taught, meaning you position yourself in a superior way. So this is what I found problematic. But in terms of securitized notion, this incompatibility of Islam with a democracy rhetoric, or discourse, I should say, surely fed into the representation of Middle Eastern people as dangerous again.
Thank you, Münevver. Are there any last questions? There is one more question.
My question also relates to the your Middle Eastern article. When you talk about the Middle East, it's a very big region. Would you say every country and sub-regions have been securitized in the same way and at the same time? Because Orientalist conceptions have been known to evolve through times and also depending to where they come from. So do you think we can still think of the Middle East as one block in the way in which it is securitized?
Thank you.
The last remark I couldn't hear. Can you repeat it with regard to securitized?
Yeah, I was saying that Orientalist conceptions have been known to evolve through time, and also have been attached differently to different spaces. My underlining question would be: can you think of the securitization of the Middle East as one block?
Yeah. This is a very good question again. Thank you. Well, it's very interesting. There is a general view of the Middle East in Europe. We cannot, of course, say that it's always referred to as a monolithic bloc. But the thing is that there's a very general view of the Middle East as conflictual. And this is what I came across in the documents. That is why I actually selected specifically those documents on the EU's general approach to the region, where if there is not a specific conflict like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, those documents only refer to the region as a whole. But the thing is that my research also shows that, for example, the EU for a specific period of time, especially after, it's like especially after the uprisings, and especially in the not last few years, but before, not nowadays. But Tunisia was specifically shown as an example, and that refers to actually my first, it's like my first view of the EU representing the Middle East as the liminal and the one to be cooperated with, right? So there, Tunisia was always shown as an example. In terms of democratization, in terms of how it cooperates, etc. So this is how it goes. That I guess answers your question about whether specific countries are not securitized to that level. But the thing is that still, it's like there is a security logic behind supporting Tunisia. Because the major aim of the European neighborhood policy is to create a ring of well-governed countries around Europe. And this comes from the European security strategy, as you know, which used the same wording. So the thing is that, even when the EU tries to cooperate, and specifically with certain countries, that's either to regulate migration nowadays, but beforehand as well, to achieve security and stability in those regions, so that the EU and Europe as a whole would not be affected by migratory flows or terrorism, etc., etc. So that's how it goes. Even when, I don't know if it's the place to mention it, but, even when the EU refers to women's rights, on the one hand, they depict a Middle Eastern women as weak and being subjected to family violence, etc. On the one hand. On the other hand, they refer to Middle Eastern women as potential terrorists, especially suitable for suicide bombing, for example. So the thing is that even those depictions are very much burdened with preconceived notions of the Middle East.
Thank you so much, Münevver, for being with us. For being with us in Amsterdam virtually, although you're in Istanbul. It has been great talking to you and also discussing with you your evolution as a researcher and as an academic, but also delving more into the ways that you do your research, your positionalities as well, And I'm sure this has been helpful for all of the students here as they are embarking on the journey of slowly starting writing up their thesis. But also, I guess, for the viewers who will eventually be seeing this this interview or Meet the Researcher series. I know how busy you are. You were telling us earlier about the teaching that you have to do. So I really appreciate you being with us and making the time to be with us. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. Thank you. It was a pleasure for me.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye-bye.